edition of Chargers Unleashed. Jake Hefner and Dan Wolkenstein here with you from the LAFB Network. This is your first time tuning into the show. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Dan Wolkenstein, the date is April 2nd, but by God, you wouldn't know it based off of Jim Harbaugh's comments at the podium today, Ben Herbert's comments at the podium today. You would have thought it was the first day of OTAs or training camp, because talk about just getting you fired up. I know that like we're in peak draft season right now, but this is the ultimate just like football needs to be back type moment, because it's just like we need to see these guys out there in pads right now going up against each other. I mean, again, you would have thought that this was the beginning of the preseason based on some of the comments today. We had we had Jim Harbaugh, Hayden Hurst, Ben Herbert at the podium today, just talking about the first day of getting everybody back into the training room, trying for organized team activities. But Dan Wolkenstein, I'm fired up to talk about this, and we're just talking about comments. We didn't see anything. There was no on-field drills going on today, but by God, there were quotes galore that just made you want to get up and go shoulder block a brick wall, honestly.
And we're going to get into all of that. Yeah, Jake, you heard Jim Harbaugh at the coaches meeting, April 2nd. That's what he was gearing up for. And because new coaching staff, you get in a couple weeks earlier than the rest of the folk. And we have hit April 2nd, and it did not disappoint. And it just feels good. It still is crazy to me, Jake, that we're seeing Jim Harbaugh sport the bolt on the shirt, on the hat. The guy looks fired up, and we'll get into all of the discussion and like the key points. But like for me, you're right. The energy, man, like the enthusiasm unknown to mankind was flowing through that press conference, and it permeates through the team, through the players, the front office, the staff, like all of them. And it's fun to finally have Chargers football back. You said it. They're not in pads right now. No one's getting lit up, but we're talking about things that are really, really important, things that have been lacking from this team. So lots of takeaways. Also, Jake, Chargers signed somebody today.
Yeah, right. Literally right after the press conference was over. It was announced that the Chargers signed former Baltimore Raven, former Michigan Wolverine, H-back Ben Mason. So the Chargers officially now have a fullback on their roster.
Been a minute.
It's been a minute. Well, I mean, it's there in terms of a fullback that's actually coming in and making an impact. Yes, it's been a minute, but there's a lot to like about Ben Mason when you get to dig into his tape. And again, it fits into the mold of everything that we have heard Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman talk about what they want to do to revitalize this run game.
Yes. So, Jake, we'll get into it. You said we're going to get into all the press conference takeaways, things that we thought were interesting, some of the quotes. But before we do that, Jake, let's pay the bills. Let's talk about our friends.
Want to remind everybody that the easiest way to get into all of the sports action, it's Underdog Fantasy and their pick'em game. Just pick higher or lower on your favorite or least favorite player stats, and you could win up to 20 times your money in a single night. Underdog keeps it super simple with their easy-to-use website and mobile apps. Just pick between 2 and 5 players to fill out your pick'em entry. Get every pick right and take home some cold, hard cash. Use the promo code UNLEASHED and to get your first deposit doubled up to $500 by Underdog. Going over to Underdog Fantasy today and let them know that Chargers Unleashed sent you.
Coaches meeting. Fast forward. April 2nd for those watching. April 2nd. Jim Harbaugh sporting the Chargers colors at the podium today, Jake. Energy in full flux. You heard lots of takeaways, lots of kind of key themes. The eagerness, the lift that I think was permeated between player and coaching staff, the energy. Ben Herbert talked about like the urgency within that locker room. Key takeaways. What were some of the biggest things that you got from Jim Harbaugh today?
Jim Harbaugh is just, if you didn't get the emotion from him during his introductory press conference, couple months ago. It just, the energy's not going anywhere from Jim. Again, we're not in pads. We're not actually out there doing drills yet, but the energy from Jim is just still there. First of all, he opens the press conference by basically saying, this feels like a happy new year, first day back at school. He goes on to say that this is the best job that he has had to start with. And I'm assuming in terms of assistant coaches, personnel around him. So lauding all of that, just you could see the excitement permeating out of him. The best part about this entire sequence of question and answer from Jim Harbaugh is that it's very Jim Harbaugh. If we know anything about any interviews that we ever heard from Jim Harbaugh at Michigan or back in the day of San Francisco, it's very on point for how Jim Harbaugh talks. Just, again, throwing out the one-liners. Dan, you mentioned the enthusiasm beyond all mankind. He's got fat is the biggest enemy of speed. It's just like, it's so true. But it's just like the way it comes in sequencing when talking about training. It's just like, yes, that's absolutely true. That's something that you would probably read on like the wall of 24-hour fitness. And here he is just dropping these type of things.
I'm gonna have to put that on my mirror every morning before I wake.
Right.
Before I
just a reminder. Just a reminder. But there's going to be a lot of cross conversation here between what Jim Harbaugh had to say about Ben Herbert and then what Ben Herbert had to say about Jim Harbaugh, because there were a lot of questions presented to Jim about Jim about Ben Herbert and what he's going to be bringing to this locker room, because obviously that was one of the big additions in the offseason and bringing in Ben Herbert as the strength and conditioning coach. It's obviously been well documented what he was able to bring to that Minnesota team for so many years. But this was some of the quotes that Jim Harbaugh had to say about Ben Herbert. So basically saying he's going to be in the weight room from 6 a.m. to 5 p.m. every day, bringing the energy, bringing the detail-oriented style that he likes to bring when it comes to training and building people up. Dan, this is probably one of the best analogies I've ever heard. Jim Harbaugh compared Ben Herbert to Ben Affleck's character in The Accountant. If you haven't seen The Accountant, Ben Affleck's character is extremely detail-oriented. So in those type of scenes, and this is actually what Jim's going through. He's saying he's only got one fork, he's only got one knife, and he's only got one plate. When he cooks his food, cooking breakfast, he's got 3 pancakes, he's got 3 eggs, he's got 3 pieces of bacon. And when he sits down, he's separating everything. He doesn't want any food touching one another, just like so detail-oriented. That was basically how Jim Harbaugh was describing Ben Herbert and his attention to detail. But he basically said that he's going to be in there in the weight room with the energy to make them better. He's there for them, mental, physical. There's a bounce in his step today when he comes up. And trust me, once he got to the podium, and we'll talk about him in a little bit. Once he got to the podium, you're like, oh my God, this guy hasn't uttered one word and he already means business. So that just goes to show you what it means a little bit more about Jim Harbaugh bringing in Ben Herbert. Dan, quickly, your thoughts on some of those.
Yeah, I think when we heard the Jim Harbaugh coming to the Chargers news and then Ben Herbert, it has been widely talked about how impressive and how successful Ben Herbert has been in Michigan and how good and how credible he is as a strength and conditioning guru. And the confidence that he brings to Jim Harbaugh and the staff and the experience that he brings, it permeates through the building. And, Jim Harbaugh had said Ben Herbert is the best he's ever seen as a strength coach. And we're talking Jim Harbaugh, who has seen some dudes considering his family ties to football, and Ben Herbert having arguably the best of the best. He talks about kind of like the baseline training I thought was really interesting, which we'll get to what Hayden Hurst and Ben Herbert talk about it. But this was more about like setting up the scheme and philosophy stuff, and then talks about baseline training. And that goes to Ben Herbert and kind of how meticulous he is about caring for his players. And so I think the part for me that Jim Harbaugh brought today was just the energy that he has because of the folks that he brought in and the players on the field or in the locker room today. And it's just refreshing, I think, to have a coach who has a proven track record, who brings in a staff that he has had proven success with, and to have that energy and excitement and to have the players bought in. And again, this is day one, who knows? But you saw a whole bunch of players there while it's quote unquote voluntary. All of them were there. The ones that, at least, I shouldn't say all of them. I'm sure there were some that weren't, but you saw Derwin was there. You saw Alohi Gilman was there. Justin Herbert was there. Players in the team are bought in. And so there was one little nugget that he had talked about at the very beginning of the press conference, Jake, that I want to get to real quick, is he kind of talked about like how important this time of the offseason is. And he talked about the draft and training, but he harped on and kind of took a little extended pause about free agency, and specifically saying, quote, free agency goes on for a while. And I know how eager Chargers fans are to get some of these players drafted. And we're wanting to know why they haven't signed XYZ free agent. You've heard people talk about it. There are waves of free agency. And I am as confident as you can be. I can't say 100%, but I'll go 99.5 that there will be more free agents. And the fact, to your point, the fact that the fullback was signed during the press conference was pretty hilarious. So Jim Harbaugh, like, he's a coach's coach, and his staff that he brought in, I think he also talked about the fact that, like, he's expecting this staff to be built like a pipeline, and they set up their own pipeline, expect them to be poached. And again, that's what Jim Harbaugh does. He develops coaches just as well, if not better, than players.
Yeah, his exact quote on that as it relates to the coaching staff that's been created now for the Chargers says, I also like to have coaches that are the next position coaches and guys that are getting their start, like a pipeline. We just set up our own internal pipeline. There's a progression there. He says, I will predict that there will be head coaches that come off of this staff. You got to love that mentality. You really do, because that's where you start. So not only do you set up coaches that are now eventually obviously going to end up finding their own success, but you keep building that internally to where you don't have to go out and look so much to externally coaches. Obviously, will that at some point change? Yes. But when we're talking about just turnover in general, which happens to a lot of teams that find success for their coaching staff, look at what happened to the Baltimore Ravens this past year. You're set up for success because you're already building that pipeline. That is a fantastic mentality to start building, and a mindset to have among your coaches in terms of how you want to grow this staff.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you one piece on the fullback thing, and you can look at this two different ways. But before we get to Hayden Hurst and Ben Herbert, you're seeing a lot of plucking former players connected to this staff, specifically the Ravens and or Michigan, but mostly the Ravens. And hell, you can say coaching staff. You look at Navarro Bowman as well. Do you find it as a positive or a negative that so many of the guys that this staff has brought in have been former Ravens? Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I find it as a great thing. I find it as a great thing. Now, I get that whole idea of where you're trying to go from there. It's like, okay, are the Chargers trying to become Baltimore West, essentially? But, I mean, no. Why wouldn't you think that this is a great thing, whether it's for Hayden Hurst or for Gus Edwards or any other player that's had familiarity with Jim Harbaugh? Or
same way.
Yes, you're gonna get these guys that are gonna hit the ground running. As Hayden Hurst goes on to say today, the terminology and the translation between John Harbaugh and Jim Harbaugh is virtually the same. So why wouldn't you want something like that from an outside free agent and not want some familiarity and to get kind of a leg up on the rest of the locker room and kind of like use them to say to the rest of the guys that aren't so familiar with the terminology to say, hey, this is where we're going with this. This is what he's looking for. This is what he's saying in this circumstance. So I look, if we're talking about, especially as it relates to the run game, I have no issues with this at all. From the tight end standpoint, the Chargers have needed that. Now, it may not be some of the names that people were initially thinking in terms of going out and doing that. But look, whether it's the Baltimore Ravens or anybody else, what Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman have talked about in terms of revitalizing the run game and getting guys to come in here and be more physical that can block, so far, so good. I know we haven't gotten to the draft yet, and this roster is far from over. But in terms of making low-level moves with familiarity that still fit into the overall scheme of what you want to do and what you're setting out to do,
yeah,
check.
Yeah, and I think that's where I understand, because I think there's two sides to this, right? It's like, come on, can we not get our own guys? Can we not develop our own players? And to some extent, I get it, but also the draft hasn't happened yet. So what are you supposed to do? Free agency, again, you mentioned it. They're not going for these huge top tier talent, at least not yet. Although those rumors of the Tyler Boyd connection, who knows? But I'll say this to the people who are kind of grumpy about the not going outside of Baltimore land, especially for the run game, beggars can't be choosers, man. The Chargers have had zero run game, very little pass protection, zero successful scheme. And so if they go and get everyone from Baltimore and they tell me that will turn into a successful running game, cool. Let's sign me up, because until the run game is fixed, I don't care who they bring in. If they can fix it, I'm golden. So smooth transition to you, Jake. Hayden Hurst at the podium today. And he talked about him referring to the ease of transition from previous coaching regimes to now with Greg Roman. Hayden Hurst was talking about, I think there's also some mention about the concussion that he went through before, where it actually wasn't nearly as bad as I think some people may have reported, that it was maybe a week-to-week thing. And then because the team was so bad that they just said, whatever, just shut it down. It's not worth it. What were the main takeaways for you for Hayden Hurst before we get to the star of the show today, which is Ben Herbert?
Yeah, I mean, he talked about obviously why it was an easy decision to come to the Chargers based on the familiarity between Jim Harbaugh, Greg Roman, Joe Ortiz. It just made an easy decision for him. You talked about the concussion aspect. He detailed that and basically saying that was more of a front office move to keep him from playing for that duration of time. So it sounded like it was more precautionary than anything else, which, whichever way you want to look at it, obviously concussions are no small matter whatsoever. But in that circumstance, it doesn't seem like it was more of the concussions that was keeping him off. It would sound like that was more of a front office decision in that circumstance. Went in to talk about Jim Harbaugh. And this was basically his quote that he had said about Jim Harbaugh. He said, he wants to win. And he wants to get guys to get better. He wants guys to get healthy, have success. It just makes it fun. This is really a long season. If you don't have the right people in place, obviously if you don't have the right people in place, there's a big difference for that. That last part wasn't part of his quote, but you get the mentality of where Jim is coming from in that circumstance.
Yeah, and I think one piece that we hear a lot of people talking, it's why a lot of people are still mentioning the idea of the Chargers going offensive tackle at 5 and how important the trenches and physicality are to Jim Harbaugh and company. Hayden Hurst talked about the emphasis that Jim Harbaugh put on physicality specifically, and was talking about it literally being in PowerPoints that were presented.
Yep.
And kind of the goal to impose their will on other teams by the time the clock runs out. This is how Jim Harbaugh wins. And you've heard a few people who are familiar with Jim Harbaugh's teams over the years. They impose their will, they dominate you to where they win physically, mentally, emotionally, and just grind out teams. That's how they win. And how often, Jake, have we seen this Chargers team be on the receiving end of that and have been broken?
Too many
and
times.
You watch it happen. I don't remember the last time, maybe Marty Ball was the last time I saw the Chargers have that type of identity, which even that identity isn't quite this, but it's been a decade plus since we've seen the Chargers be the physically imposing team. And that's what Hayden Hurst spoke to. Ben Herbert talks about this too, but Jim Harbaugh talks about it as well. Like, that's what, and like the funny maniacal part is like, this team's going to get off on that.
Yeah. It really gets you excited for Greg Roman's philosophy of what he wants to do. I mean, it should be no secret. Obviously, Greg Roman likes to run the ball. He's had success in doing it as an offensive coordinator in San Francisco and in Baltimore. Hayden Hurst talked about that just in terms of his coaching philosophy. He just quickly said he's downhill physical and he's coming at you. He said he knows that entire scheme to his core. What I really liked in terms of him detailing that, he said you kind of take it as a challenge because in terms of for 60 minutes of playing football, you're basically going to outwork them. Hayden said, I know that I can do that, but some other players in the league can't do that for 60 minutes. So it's a mano challenge. Are you up for it? And he's to himself, he's like, I know I can do that. It's then my job to go out and outwork the guy who's playing against me for 60 minutes.
And that kind of ties into the star of the show, in my opinion.
Plenty of little notes from this man.
Ben Herbert, strength and conditioning, director of player performance. Dude, like, run through a brick wall the moment he steps up at the podium.
God.
And Hayden Hurst talked about, like, some of the specifics where I said earlier about Jim Harbaugh with baseline training. And Hayden Hurst had talked about that baseline test where he said, like, that's not something that they've seen in the NFL. And the staff wanting to kind of like fix you from the ground up and see your deficiencies and breaking everything down to where some of those like soft tissue injuries and stuff don't happen as much. And obviously he's referring to Ben Herbert's program. And insert stage left, Ben Herbert. And the specificity and the focus and the experience and the confidence and the rationale behind all of it and the trust that he has gotten from his previous teams, rosters, and knowing he will get that from this team, but it is built. Ben Herbert is the real deal, man.
Wow.
Like that, like Jim Harbaugh, where he's forgotten more than most people have learned when it comes to football and coaching. Ben Herbert's the same way with player performance. That he feels like the type where you can go to him about anything health related and he can go a mile deep on whatever topic you want. Ben Herbert, dude, he has these guys going in a direction that they have never gone before. And I don't say that lightly, like literally. They're doing things they've never done.
This may have been like the closest fly on the wall type of situation that we could have gotten here, because when Ben Herbert took the stage, first of all, when he gets up there, before he even says a word, his eyes are just like wide open. He's got this like, just happy little grin on his face.
For folks watching, look at the picture. Like, this is him.
I mean, that was pretty much it. It's just like laser focused. I got a, cool ass smirk on my face. Like, what do you got for me? Because I'm ready to go. I just came out of these meetings and I'm hyped. First of all, one of the first things he said was he was explaining what he was telling the players. He said, I am here for one reason. That's to impact you in the most positive way. And then he basically went off on 5 key things that he explained to the players in terms of what it is that they're going to be doing in terms of this strength and conditioning program in a macro sense. He said, 1, he's like, I'm going to make you harder to break. And he kind of changed that whole narrative. It's like, you hear about training programs breaking people down. That's not how I do things. I make you harder to break. 2, we talked about consistency. If you can work at this consistently, you're going to make yourself better. 3, attention to detail. This is where everything from Jim Harbaugh came into place in terms of what he was talking about that. And I'll elaborate on this, but he was basically saying the way that they have set up the weight room, if you go into a weight room and you have a 45-pound plate, in the case of the Chargers, they have plates on there that are the Rogue brand. So they have Rogue written on them. When you get in there, the word Rogue is set in a certain way. When the players take those off and when they put them back on the rack on the pile, he wants them to put them back in the exact same way. He wants all the Rogue words on each one of the plates facing the exact way. That was basically how he was saying it. 4 was emotional stability. And 5, bigger, faster, stronger. Right then is when I decided to make a tweet, because obviously I was just sitting there watching this in just complete awe, and I wanted to go, outside and for a second workout today after hearing that already. But I basically said, if Ben Herbert ever came out with a strength and conditioning workout routine video, I would buy it. And then I got to thank Boltzilla on Twitter for this, because literally within 5 minutes, he says, "Oh, you mean this?" And he attaches a link that apparently there was a workout video that he created at his time in Michigan. It says 45 exercises for strength and conditioning by Ben Herbert.
Oh,
and I'm like,
we all need to get to this.
I'm sold. You got me. So kudos to him for being just on the spot with that. Dan, there's plenty more from this, but just that first little bit of those first quotes from Ben Herbert, takeaways.
The making you harder to break, I think the nuance there is special. There's this idea that a lot of people utilize where they say like, "Oh, you're prehabbing so you don't have to rehab," right? You're prehabbing so that you don't get injured. And he kind of doesn't go by that philosophy. He's more about breaking things down and preparing you for playing to where you can reduce the possibility of getting injured. And it might sound the same, but it's different in the sense that he focuses on the granular pieces of your body and body parts to make it more malleable, to make it stronger, to make it more flexible, to not just prevent injury, but to make you a better player and to maximize what you have. I mean, he's talking about stuff around like lean mass, and he's talking about how to get things in a way for you to maximize your potential. But to have someone on your staff that has that proven track record, making these players harder to break, to your point, to bring in consistency and emotional stability, which, Jake, we've seen this team kind of go off the rails emotionally and have some boneheaded decisions that have cost this team dearly. Like, this is important stuff. And I think it's interesting that it's coming from the strength and conditioning department, because obviously like that comes from the head coach, but to develop that at such a ground floor of not just how they're coached, but how they're trained, how they're exercised, like that's a big change for this team. And so far, like, I mean, obviously I'm sold, but the goal is not to break you. The goal is to make you harder to break. Like, I thought that was such a gold quote and a pillar.
There were so many times that I felt like I was just getting a crash course in kinesiology from Ben Herbert, because he would just start talking about these, your ankle, your soft tissue injuries. Even Jim Harbaugh kind of talked about things that he talked about as it relates to the neck and to the traps. He's like, that's the most important muscles to reduce head injuries. And Jim Harbaugh kind of explained it like, do you want a steel rod in your neck or do you want a noodle? Is how Jim Harbaugh explained it. It's just like, what side of that coin do you want to be on? Dan, he went on to talk about the infamous shop vac Home Depot story with Jim Harbaugh, basically just when they got into the weight room. Again, another aspect of how detail oriented Ben Herbert is. Basically told Jim, said, hey, I need a shop vac because I need to clean up the weight room. So they went to Home Depot, got a shop vac, came back, and just, again, attention to detail. He said every inch of that room, we went through and vacuumed it, reorganized it, and the players, when they got in there, they could tell that obviously everything was different. Nothing is going to be missed with Ben Herbert like this when you just see what some people would consider just a trivial thing. This is how big of a deal he is making to bring a different result. So I guess what I would finish on, and Jim Harbaugh had said this about Ben Herbert as well, what you do speaks so loudly that I can't hear what you say. That was Ben Herbert's message. It's taking that whole actions speak louder than words to a whole new level. Let everything you do speak so loudly that I cannot hear what you say. Get up. Go do something right now. Whatever it is that you're doing. I need to go do something right now. I need to get off this podcast and go do something right now. I feel lazy enough here talking about it. I need to go do something.
It's fair. It's so true. And Ben Herbert talked about, you said Jim Harbaugh. Like Ben Herbert talked about how easy of a decision it was for him to go along with Jim Harbaugh to LA. And how gracious and how grateful he was for the opportunity that Jim Harbaugh has given him, and essentially said how it's a very brief conversation he had with his wife, and they immediately said, yep, we're going. And how well those two work together. It really is incredible to me, Jake, like how much of an impact Ben Herbert has had on Jim Harbaugh and how important he was to this coaching staff. It's wild to me. Like the fact that they're having the director of player performance at the podium on the first day of, like, that doesn't happen unless it's someone of the stature of Ben Herbert with the proven success and track record of Ben Herbert. Going on to say, like, I'm not known to give bad advice. At some point, this team will understand that I'm giving them what's in their best interest. The dude just gets it, man. And he's got a stock full of receipts of good decisions and examples of the things that he does and why it works. I was not expecting this to get me fired up, but whoa, he was flamethrower.
I mean, do you think that the Chargers, in terms of players, by the time that we get to minicamp and training camp, that they're not going to be in a hell of a lot better shape than they normally are at that period of the year? Oh my God.
It just reminds me of like being battle tested. Like
yes.
you hear infamous stories of the team, like back with Michigan or even in San Francisco, where like you've heard stories like practices were harder than football games. And that's kind of what it's like. You're starting to see stuff like this. You're starting to see why. And to be battle tested and to have like the emotional stability and to have the conditioning, you're getting why it's happening. Like, look who's leading the effort.
Yeah, and look, I know I'm very hyped up about those Ben Herbert comments, and nor am I saying that he is going to be the one that's going to turn everything around, but I damn sure believe that he is going to be a foundation of a change as it relates to these players. Obviously, the rest of the position coaches are going to have their work cut out for them. The players themselves are going to have their work cut out for them in order to get better. But in terms of Ben Herbert, and this is why so many people talked about how important this hire was, he is going to create that foundation in order for them to take that next step in their play to get better.
It's like a full circle, holistic approach to football success that we just don't see very often in this industry. So exciting times. Day one, April 2nd is officially behind us. As everything starts, they're implementing stuff offensively, philosophical on defense, try to get the program set up for strength and conditioning, and all that buy-in, all that work starts today. Jake, anything else? Any big rocks? Any quotes we missed that we want to discuss before we get out of here?
I think we covered all the big ones, my friend. It's now like I just made a tweet about, these next 23 days before the draft are going to feel like the longest 23 days of the year. Today almost made me wanted to say, is it August yet?
Oh,
is it August yet? That's what I felt watching this press conference. It's like, I know we got plenty of time to go before we get back to the preseason, but this made me want to go to work. This made me want football to come back.
100%. 100%. Big news, special guest episode coming to you on Thursday. Be on the lookout for that one. So make sure you hit that like and subscribe. Make sure you turn on notifications so you can see or hear the next time the episode comes up. But Jake, I think that'll wrap it up. For Jake, you can find him at Jake D. Hefner, myself at Dan W. Sports. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time on Chargers Unleashed.